what's going on in AP World? We have Chapter 4 of Alan Brinkley's American History for you today. Probably the most important chapter for colonial America. Lots to cover. Let's get going. All right, we're going to start off talking about an idea called salutary neglect, and this had been around for quite a while regarding the British relations with the colonists. And it is best exemplified by Prime Minister Robert Walpole not enforcing the Navigation Act. So you might think to yourself, what are those Navigation Acts again? Well, these are acts passed by Britain that stated that the colonists could only trade with Great Britain. So colonists weren't doing this under Prime Minister Walpole, and he kind of looked the other way. Colonists were smuggling, and he kind of let them do whatever. So many colonists also during this time saw each other as foreigners. They didn't really have anything in relation with somebody from another colony. So there's this lack of a permanent colonial unity, but this is going to change in the coming years. In 1754, we have something called the Albany Congress, and this was called to form a peace treaty with the Iroquois. The British and the French were having issues with each other, and the British wanted to get the Iroquois on their side, or at least keep them from joining with the French. At the same time, we have the Albany Plan of Union, which was proposed by Benjamin Franklin, and it called for kind of a intercolonial government. And it was approved by the delegates at the conference, but it was rejected by the colonial assemblies. And the reason why the colonies rejected it is because they feared tax powers. And the British also rejected it because they felt it gave too much power to the colonists. And this is where you see Ben Franklin's join or die political cartoon. And he urged the colonies to unite or face a certain death. So we have the French and Indian War, and before that happens, the French and the English are competing for native loyalties, or loyalties of the Native Americans. France was more tolerant of the two countries. They intermarried, they traded with them more, and treated them better. But England really had a lot more goods to offer the Native Americans. In 1754, the French and Indian, also called the 7 Years' War, occurs, and this was started by George Washington at a fort, Fort Necessity, which was located near the French fort of Duquesne, located in present-day Pittsburgh. Both the colonists and the British fought the French and their Native American allies, and an issue that begins to develop between the British and the colonists was that the colonists felt they were not respected. They didn't get promoted enough in their eyes, and an example of this was George Washington. He could only be promoted so far, and this was simply because they were colonists. The end of the French and Indian War is settled by the Peace of Paris of 1763, and France is essentially removed from North America. If we take a look at this map, you'll see that there's lots of orange. That's where the French had all territory in 1754 and before, and the purple is the British. Let's go to the right side, 1763. You'll notice that the orange is gone in North America, and there's lots of purple here. So Britain gains a lot of land, and France is essentially removed. So some of the effects of this war is Britain is in massive amounts of debt, and they're going to need to find a way to get money. And Britain thinks they have an answer for that, but the colonists are not going to like it. Okay, in 1763, we see salutary neglect ending. So this idea of, you can do whatever you want, colonies, that's over. Say goodbye to that. Britain begins to tax the colonies, and this is really going to upset the colonists. And we have George Grenville, who is the prime minister, a new prime minister, and he felt that the colonists should pay their fair share. This war was fought, and the colonists benefited from it, so why shouldn't they have to pay? Well, the same year the French and Indian War ends, we have a rebellion or a conflict with Native Americans led by Pontiac. If you notice here on this map, it's in the Northwest Territory, or present-day Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. So the British have an idea that they will avoid another one of these by not letting the colonists expand into that area. So this leads directly to something called the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbade colonial expansion beyond the Appalachians. So this is a very important year, 1763. We have Pontiac's Rebellion, end of salutary neglect, Proclamation Line of 1763, and the end of the French and Indian War. Please make sure you know all four of those in pretty good detail. All right, so one of the first taxes that Britain institutes after the end of salutary neglect is the Sugar Act, which is a tax on sugar to reduce the illegal sugar trade or smuggling. It actually lowers the cost of an older version of the tax. It also establishes something called vice admiralty courts, which were courts that were set up for smugglers, to try smugglers. There were no trial by juries, and you would be guilty until proven innocent. So not a very friendly court. In the same year, we have the Currency Act passed, which stated that colonists could no longer use paper money. And this was hard for a lot of colonists because gold and silver, there was not a large supply of gold and silver. Many of them did not have any. Those two acts kind of upset the colonists, but the mother of all acts that upset the colonists was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a tax on 50 paper documents, including newspapers, playing cards, marriage licenses, any legal document you could think of. And virtually every colonist bought something that would be affected by the Stamp Act. So they were very upset that this act was passed without the consent of the colonial assemblies. We will see a theme here soon that the colonists are not against taxes that are passed by their own representatives in colonial assemblies. They're simply against taxes that are passed without their consent or their representation. So the Stamp Act is going to lead to the Stamp Act Congress. And this was the first attempt at colonial unity against the British. Guys, this is so important to know. We've seen colonial unity before, or attempts at it, but never against the British. And the Stamp Act Congress is the first time. We have Patrick Henry and the Virginia Resolves, and this is a belief that Americans had the same rights as the English, and that Virginians should only pay taxes that were passed by the Virginia Assembly. Again, they shouldn't have to pay taxes passed by Parliament, only those that were passed by the Virginia Assembly. James Otis called for an intercolonial Congress to take action against the stamp tax, which we'll talk about in just a second. And we have Sons of Liberty, a group of people that joined together to protest the stamp tax, and they would terrorize stamp collectors. They would often tar and feather stamp collectors and anybody who bought British goods. So Britain finally repeals the Stamp Act because it's unsuccessful, but they issue at the same time something called the Declaratory Act. And this stated that in the future, Parliament could pass any laws whatsoever. So this was kind of a way for Parliament to save face. Okay, colonists, we'll give you what you want by repealing the Stamp Act, but in the future, we have the right to pass any law that we want whatsoever. Charles Townsend, who is essentially the British Secretary of Treasury, comes up with new ideas to raise revenue. In 1765, we have the Quartering Act, which stated that the colonists must provide quarters and supplies for British troops. In other words, room and board. British troops could come knock on your door and say, hey, I need a place to stay tonight. This place looks great. I expect a bed, a dinner, and breakfast. And there was nothing the colonists could do about it, and they would not get compensated for that. It upset the colonists so much that when they wrote the Bill of Rights in 1791, this was the Third Amendment, that Americans could not be forced to quarter troops. And in New York, the assembly was suspended because many people in New York refused to comply with the Quartering Act. The Townsend Duties were named after Charles Townsend. This was a new tax on imports such as lead, paint, paper, and tea. And this tea one is just going to stick around for a little while. So we have something called Nonimportation Agreements, and this is why the Stamp Act Congress was so successful. This was essentially a boycott of British goods, and this led to a growth of the American homespun movement, where Americans making their own clothing, and industries began to develop in America as a result. In 1770, all the Townsend taxes were repealed except for the tax on tea. In the same year, March 5th, 1770, we have a conflict between the colonists and the Redcoats in Boston. Nobody really knows why the British fired, but ultimately the British did, killing 5 colonists. And you see this very famous engraving by Paul Revere, who was a printer, and within days this was seen all throughout the colonies. So you see the British firing on a crowd of what looks like peaceful protesting colonists here, and there's pools of blood on the ground. This was a great example of propaganda during the time, and what this does not show is that this was kind of a hostile crowd here, the colonists. They were throwing snowballs at the British, and some of the snowballs even had like rocks in them. So imagine getting pelted in the face by a snowball with a rock. One of the leading revolutionaries who spoke out against the Boston Massacre was a distant cousin to the second president of the United States, John Adams, and his name was Samuel Adams. And he proposed committees of correspondence in 1772, which was another example of colonial unity, where the colonies would get together and share stories and grievances and ways to keep up with the revolutionary spirit. Well, we still have this issue of taxes in the 1770s, and Americans believed that they should only be taxed with their consent. And this whole idea, this slogan, this very popular slogan, no taxation without representation, is around. Well, England counters with something called virtual representation, and they told the colonists, you may not have somebody who is representing you that you elect into parliament, but because you are under the control of the British, we pass all laws that benefit everybody. We pass laws that benefit all people, and therefore you are virtually represented in parliament. And the colonists did not like that whatsoever. The tea issue is still around, and it gets a little more complicated in 1773. We have a company called the British East India Company, and they are on the verge of bankruptcy. They're ready to go out of business. So Britain gives them a monopoly on the tea trade in the Tea Act of 1773. And it's a tax that is designed to bail out the British East India Company. Now, this is a very interesting idea here because this actually lowers the cost of tea. This tea is actually cheaper than smuggled tea, but the colonists still hate it. Why? Because they were against all British taxes. They didn't care that this tea was now cheaper. They were upset with taxes, period. So they continued to buy smuggled tea, and that even led to the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, in which Americans board ships and dump all this British tea into the Boston harbor. Britain is furious with this, so they pass something called the Intolerable or the Coercive Acts. And what this does is it closes the port of Boston until all the damages were paid, and it also sets up something called extraterritoriality. So you hopefully know this from China in world history, but let me give you an example. So I'm a British officer. I live in Britain and I come to the United States, and I'm in the military. I'm a redcoat. I end up killing an American colonist. Normally, what would happen is I would go on trial in America, but under extraterritoriality, I would be shipped back to Britain where I would stand trial there. Now, I would not really receive a fair trial. It would probably be a slap on the wrist, and they certainly wouldn't bring along colonists who were witnesses. So Americans are upset about this. And also, the Intolerable Acts reduced colonial government power. Now, something that has passed in the same year but is not a part of the Intolerable Acts is the Quebec Act. This extended the boundaries of Quebec all the way down from Canada to the Ohio Valley. And this concerned Americans because they felt like it was an encroachment on their land again that they fought for in the French and Indian War. They also were upset because many of these people living in Quebec were Roman Catholics. So now these Roman Catholics were going to be living closer to them. So there was some religious tension there as well. The Intolerable Acts are hated by Americans, and this leads to something called the First Continental Congress. Please note the First Continental Congress was a response to the Intolerable Acts. 12 of the 13 colonies, everyone except for Georgia, meet in Philadelphia. Here they are meeting. And they created a list of grievances or complaints. They wanted to repeal most acts since 1763. In other words, they wanted to go back to the days of salutary neglect. They called for military preparations against the British in case there was going to be more conflict. And they called for strict non-importation and non-consumption of all British goods. So they wanted to continue boycotting British goods. And they promised to meet again in 1 year, which will become the Second Continental Congress. Now, let me have an important note for you. This is so important. The First Continental Congress did not want independence. Most Americans in 1774, 1775, and even some in 1776 did not want independence. They simply wanted to go back to the days of salutary neglect. Please understand that, people. That is so important to know. Okay, we have two battles. Lexington, near Boston. The British are seeking to arrest two people, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And Minutemen, most notably William Dawes and Paul Revere, they warn of the British coming. And poor William Dawes, nobody remembers him. Everybody remembers this guy, Paul Revere. So the British go to Lexington, and then the next day they go to Concord. And there's a little bit of fighting in Lexington, and 8 Minutemen were killed. In Concord, the British moved there to find some ammunition. The Americans removed most of it, but the British did burn some of it. And then the Americans fight the British all the way back to Boston using guerrilla warfare. This is going to be a sign of the American Revolution, the type of fighting that the Americans will use during the Revolution. Okay, let's look at two past essay topics that relate to this time period. One says analyze the ways in which British imperial policies between 1763 and 1776 intensified Colonials' resistance to British rule and their commitment to Republican values. That was from 2009. So, in other words, what were things that the British did that upset the colonists and how did they respond? And then from 2012, analyze the effect of the French and Indian War and its aftermath on the relationship between Great Britain and the British colonies. Confine your response to the period from 1754 to 1776. So, two very similar essays there dealing with all these acts from the 1760s and 1770s. All right, that's it for me. I hope that helped. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you have not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. Help me spread the word. If you know anybody who would benefit from this video, please let them know. And I appreciate you guys watching. Thank you very much. Have a good day, guys.